to lose weight, you are having to restrict your intake. Restricting intake is triggering for disordered eating. Like, it is essentially an incompatible situation. I find the biggest clash is between obesity prevention and eating disorder prevention strategies, because essentially one begets the other. You can't avoid that. But I really would hope that we would have more conversations, because instead of just accepting, because the thing is, in the eating disorder field, there's a lot of people with disordered eating that also, there's some which say, I can't engage in a weight loss therapy because that will trigger my eating disorders horribly, and they recognize that. But there's others which say, I've got these comorbidities and I want to lose weight for health reasons, or I want to lose weight because that's what I want to do. And I feel like those people don't have as much of a voice in the eating disorders space, because there's really strong voices around, oh, we cannot mention the O word. We can't talk about BMI as an endpoint because it's too triggering.
Today, my special guest is Dr. Robyn Brown. Dr. Robyn Brown is an associate professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Pharmacology at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Her research explores the neural mechanisms driving loss of control eating and drug addiction, with a focus on how high-fat, high-sugar foods impact the brain and behavior. Drawing on advanced techniques from behavioral models to optogenics, Robyn's work bridges neuroscience, addiction, and overeating. Without further ado, here's Dr. Robyn Brown. Hi, Dr. Robyn. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Christina.
Well, first, I'd love to hear a little bit about what do you do? Tell us a little bit more about what's a typical day in the life, and what are you working towards? Just kind of big picture.
So I run a lab actually at the University of Melbourne, and I originally started off in addiction neuroscience. So my background is in drug addiction and understanding what's happening in the brain that makes people compulsively seek out drugs. And then I moved into eating behavior, and I can tell you a story about that, but I'll just tell you a little bit about my day-to-day. So I have a research team, and all of us are really driven by that overarching question of, why do we overeat? Like, why do we eat beyond our energy needs? And, if we think about our homeostatic feeding systems, these are highly evolved systems that are meant to be completely in tune with our physiology and completely perfectly regulated, such that we only, preserve that beautiful neutral energy balance. If we go into negative energy balance, we're meant to eat so that we're in neutral, or if we're going to positive. So it's all perfectly regulated, apparently, by the hypothalamus, a part of the brain, which is a primitive part of the brain, which all animals have, because eating is essential for survival. Yet, do we always eat when our body just needs food, or do we eat for other reasons? Obviously the latter. That's why you have this podcast. And that's the fundamental question, which sort of gets me up in the morning each day and drives me to do the work that I do. And likewise for my team. So I run a team of very passionate PhD students, master students, undergraduate students. So I do a lot of research training of them, and then also staff. And we are doing a combination of preclinical work and clinical work, basically looking to understand what's happening in the brains of individuals that are struggling with that exact issue of eating beyond energy needs, and having that intent and not being able to control that behavior.
I mean, how close are we to answering that question? That's a gargantuan question on, everything involved in, why are we eating beyond our body's needs? Yeah, in your time in running the lab, how much progress have you seen, and do you foresee an end to this question, or is this something just kind of something that we'll just perpetually be working on?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that we have, as a field, progressed a lot, but we still have a ways to go. And I liken it to the substance use disorder field and fields looking at understanding addictive behavior, because again, those fields have come a long way, but we still have a ways to go. So we know so much more, but we still don't have all the answers, because obviously we have lots of people still struggling with these issues. And that's, how I got into it. I was studying addiction neuroscience as it pertained to drugs. And then I went and did a postdoc. A lot of scientists, after they finished their PhD, they'll go and do a postdoc in the US, because a lot of, the exciting research in the world happens in the US. So there's a big addiction researcher that studied cocaine, and he'd done all this seminal work, and I went and studied with him in his lab at the Medical University of South Carolina. And he and others had sort of elucidated this particular pathway in the brain, projecting from the part of the brain that helps us stay in control. So that's like the prefrontal cortex. So that helps you with consequential thinking, like thinking, if I do this, what happens, controlling your behavior, sort of that CEO part of the brain. A pathway specifically from that part of the brain down into another part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is a key part of the brain involved in reward. And in his research, he and others across the world had shown that there was a specific sort of deficit or change in synaptic plasticity. So when we talk about plasticity in the brain, a lot of people, you might have heard of the term neuroplasticity. And this is, in science, it's just a fancy word for change. If you think about it, it's the brain changing. And so we have this process of synaptic plasticity, which underlies learning and memory. So that is important synaptic plasticity processes that happen in order for us to learn new information. And in drug addiction, it seems that we have this learning happening, but it's aberrant and it's not good for us. And so we have this aberrant synaptic plasticity, which occurs specifically at synapses in the brain connecting those two brain regions. And I was in this lab in the States, and I was contributing to this research, and I was really fascinated at the time. I'd really become fascinated by the idea of highly palatable foods and junk food, and whether it could do those same things, because all I could see around me, I was in the deep south of the USA, and all I could see around me were those foods, and they were everywhere. And obviously there's a lot of people that are struggling with regulating their consumption of their foods. And even myself personally, having had all the drugs and alcohol in the world and experimented, didn't have any problems with those things. But for me, it was saying no to, say, chocolate. That was a vice for me. So if I was, really stressed out, I wasn't reaching for a glass of wine, I was reaching for some chocolate. Mm-hmm. And I could really see that drive towards that food in myself. But also when you talk to other people, that's for lots of people, this is an issue. And, we have this key sort of diagnostic measurement in substance use disorder, or any addiction, as we say. The diagnostic criteria is, does the behavior persist despite adverse consequences? So in the case of addiction, that might be, does the behavior persist in the face of that person's relationship breaking down, or, maybe their job is at risk because of their drug taking. And if the behavior is persisting, then that is a key diagnostic criteria. And when you think about junk food and eating, we have people that are struggling with, really unhealthy levels of weight gain, that are being told by their doctors and medical practitioners, if you don't lose some weight, you will suffer serious health consequences. In morbid obesity, you could be dead in like 10 years with really extreme morbid obesity, and that person will still struggle to change their behavior in the face of what is really the most adverse consequence you can get. So that really struck me. I was surrounded by that in the deep south in the USA, and I convinced my boss at the time to let me apply this question of whether we see this addiction-like neuropathology in a model of diet-induced obesity, not just cocaine addiction. He'd looked at it and found it in cocaine, heroin, and or morphine, and nicotine. And so I was saying, well, if it happens, then maybe for some people this is happening with junk food. And so you can't look in the brains of people and measure synaptic plasticity in people, but you can do it in rodent models. So I got rats, and rats are very similar to humans in the sense that if you give them, well, this particular strain of rat, it's an outbred Sprague-Dawley rat, so that laboratory rat, that white rat that you all know. And if you give these rats junk food, they love it. And they, some of them will overeat and overconsume and become obese. And some will maintain their, somehow just have a better sense of maintaining their consumption, and they won't overeat and they'll just stay normal weight. And some will be in between and sort of what we would classify as overweight. So it's almost this beautiful titration of the similar proportions that we see in people, which is, some approximately a third now in most developed countries or developing countries even of people will be obese, a third overweight, and a third normal weight. So it's actually more normal now to be overweight or obese than normal weight. And so the rats are similar. And so I took the rats that were overeating and becoming obese. So importantly, it had to be a diet-induced BMI state. So the idea that you have junk food creating it, not a metabolic reason for their obesity, because we also know that a lot of obesity can come from various different sources. And these, and then so the obese rats versus the normal weight rats, and looked at their behavior. And when I put them through the rat equivalent of addiction testing, so you can get the diagnostic criteria for addiction and measure them in rats as well. And they showed, the persistence despite adverse consequences. They showed compulsive loss of control over their eating. They showed just high motivation for getting this junk food. And so essentially they were showing all the behavioral characteristics of an addictive-like disorder. And then when we looked at their synapses, they showed that same hallmark change, or we don't know if it's pre-existing or a change, but in response to that junk food and that behavior, they were showing that addiction-like impairment in synaptic plasticity in the brain. So that was really sort of validating for me. It sort of confirmed what I thought, which was that for some people, it basically means that there is likely an addiction-like, and I'm sure people that are suffering from this can already say, and I would always speak to people that just in my general speaking to lay people would say, oh, look, of course, I've got a food addiction. So I know that in myself, but from a scientific perspective and a medical perspective, it was still a very controversial idea. And so we needed some evidence. So this was really, I thought, good evidence to show that for some people it is like an addiction and there's something in their brains that is changing, or potentially, and this is some other work that we're looking at right now, is that there could be a pre-existing vulnerability. So whether or not there's a pre-existing vulnerability there in some people, or a combination of the two, because we know that it's a combination of something pre-existing combined with something environmental. That means, you could end up, why is it that some of those rats overeat and overconsume and show the addictive-like behavior in response to junk food versus the ones that don't? I think it really is just the same with people. And so that was the key finding that then got published, and then I came back to Australia, kept going, and now we're sort of looking at drivers of that eating, because in drug addiction you also have key precipitants of relapse. So you have cues, contexts that drive relapse, you have stress that drives relapse. So during COVID, I got very interested in the idea of stress and how that drives eating, because during lockdown in Australia, at least, we had really severe lockdowns and people were very stressed. We couldn't go within, 5 kilometers, beyond 5 kilometers of our homes, and the spike in emotional eating was huge. And so that's when I developed a model of emotional eating, and we're trying to get to the bottom of what's happening in the brain there as well.
Do you know, Robyn, this is so fascinating. And first of all, I want to say, what a cool boss you had back then who allowed you to do that research and sort of go out on a limb, which is really great for what we know now. And I'm interested in what you talked about. You said there's that pre-existing, or, is it pre-existing or is it kind of new? What is it? And the other, and I see that in my clients a lot, that, people come and they say, I've had this forever. Like, I think it's always been like that. Not everyone, but many people do that. But another question, a question I've got is, you also have done some research that showed that stress eating disproportionately affects women. And that's also, again, what I see in my client population. Tell us about that. How is that? Are women's brains different? What did you uncover there?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area as well. And so I'm sure that through your clinical experience, like you've just said, Vanessa, we do have so many more women. All of this sort of disordered eating behavior that we see by far disproportionately affects women. I mean, eating disorders are very much a female phenomenon. Obviously, there are some males, but the difference between males and females when it comes to this sort of eating is profound. That is something that we have been really interested in. The problem was at the point when we're starting to study it is that a lot of the research hadn't actually been done in females. And this speaks to an actual bias historically in both clinical and preclinical research, in the sense that women were always sort of put in the too hard basket, even though we represent literally half the population. It was easier to, because there was I'm putting in inverted commas, confound of the estrous cycle, making it, potentially difficult to interpret data. That was the thinking behind it. But as a result, we've had nearly all of research until just recent decade, I would say, predominantly based on male findings and male physiology, both preclinical and clinical, which is mind-blowing, really, when you think about it. Like we've been taking medications that have been predominantly tested in men. Women we now have there's a lot of researchers doing great work in this area, but we have a much better appreciation for the fact that women and men, anatomy, physiology, everything is so different and needs to be treated differently. When we went to sort of examine this idea of whether stress disproportionate, because there's also this idea that women are more emotional, and that maybe this is why women emotionally eat, because women are emotional, and that's why. And it was really validating for us to see that if we gave mice an emotional, I'll say, putting an emotional in inverted commas, because you can't necessarily say mice are emotional, but say a psychological stressor, a mild one, female mice will overeat and binge more compared to male mice. And so this was really important information, just that alone, because that's telling us that it's not about society's view of women, and it's not about us thinking, oh, women are more emotional. We have more psychosocial pressure around our bodies and this and that. No, it's because mice don't have that. Yet female mice are showing the same difference compared to male mice. So this is telling us that it's biological. So that finding in and of itself is very interesting. But then we've dug deeper into the sort of neural circuits that seem to be driving that behavior. We did look to see whether hormones were responsible. Our first pass look at that doesn't look like they were. It looks to be that there's something different about the brain. And we have discovered that in females, a specific circuit projecting from a part of the brain involved in reward to a part of the brain called the insular cortex, which is involved in, you talked about somatic work that you were doing earlier, Christina. In the insular cortex is very much involved in interoception and the connection between the mind and the body, and feeling from the body. So I thought that was very interesting that this circuit seems to be specifically involved. But that is just one little circuit, and the whole sort of network is yet to be uncovered. We have some clinical work going at the moment. I've got in collaboration with some amazing researchers also at University of Melbourne, where we've got people that we're putting in scanners, people with suffer from say binge eating disorder or bulimia nervosa, comparing to people that don't, and looking at putting them through a stress task. So giving them, say, a really tricky maths problem and then telling them they're doing really badly on it and getting them stressed, and then looking to see what happens when we have this thing called a gustometer, which is a machine which delivers a little bit of chocolate or strawberry milk into your mouth while you're in the brain imaging machine. And so we can look to see whether the response to that taste of that chocolate milk or cues associated with palatable foods, how that changes under stress versus no stress conditions in, say, people that don't suffer from this kind of disordered eating compared to the people that do. And so that work is ongoing at the moment, and we're going to have findings from that hopefully pretty soon. And that's going to really get to that question as well, which will be really fascinating. And of course, for the people enrolled in the study, the vast majority were women.
There's so many different manifestations of loss of control, bulimia, binge eating, food addiction that are typically considered to be treated in different ways. And yet loss of control is, I believe it is a transdiagnostic criteria. Like it's something that is manifested across these different conditions and more. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how can we make sense of that?
I find I don't want to say terminology and diagnosis for disordered eating are reasonably problematic in the sense that we still don't have, and maybe I'm sure that the content that you're providing on this show is much more understanding of all of these nuances. But unfortunately, in the, say, medical world and the psychology world, we still, I think, are very lacking in how, even just the diagnostics, the DSM, the sort of way that we diagnose these eating disorders, I think is not perfect. And so instead of, we have these behavioral symptoms that are very strict. I mean, for a while you had as a symptom of anorexia nervosa, not getting your period, but men can get anorexia nervosa as well. So really imperfect. Things are getting better, but I think the fact that we have so many diagnosed with OSFED, so like disordered eating otherwise specified, just goes to show how much we're not capturing that type of eating behavior. I think I think what we have is a spectrum. And so you have at the pointy end, I would say, when you look at the scientific literature, bulimia nervosa is typically at the pointy end of that spectrum. Obviously, you have the purging, but then without the purging, you've got binge eating disorder. So bulimia nervosa, binge eating, similar, like you've got large volumes, but then you've got this idea, and this is why the loss of control is so important. When you look at the eating disorder, diagnosis for binge eating disorder, for the DSM, it says an objectively large amount of food. But we all know that for someone with binge eating disorder, it's not about the volume, it's about that feeling of loss of control. And so you can eat a large volume of food in a controlled way and be perfectly fine with that. So why does it have to be objectively large? It needs to be subjectively an experience that person has a loss of control over. And so at the moment for binge eating disorder, I think we've got to sort that out because a lot of people aren't getting captured because of the fact that it needs to be a large volume of food in a short period of time. Below that, we have binge, OSFED includes, say, binge eating that is not binge eating disorder because it doesn't happen regularly or whatever, but it doesn't fit all the criteria. And it needs to be accompanied by a feeling of distress around the behavior. And I'm like, obviously for some people there is distress, but is that a key diagnostic criteria? Maybe not. I think what you're talking about, this loss of control, it's the linking thread to all of these manifestations of the type of eating. And really it's actually the key, most important element of them. And for people with food addiction, for example, which again is not in the DSM, and Vanessa and I have had and I'm sure you have had very long conversations around the frustrations around, like, the problem is, I think it's semantics. The term addiction even is not really used that often now even in the drug addiction field. We refer to it as substance use disorder because addiction is a stigmatizing word for some people.
Yeah.
And then we also just have food, which is not necessarily,
Right.
you know, the highly processed junk foods that we do tend to overconsume when we're stressed or when we're struggling or when we're just feeling compulsive towards food. Though for some people it doesn't have to be, but for many it is. And so food addiction as a term is problematic in that way. But, you know, as Vanessa and I have talked about this at great length, you have to have something. And so perhaps if you had addictive like eating, but again, doesn't really roll off the tongue, or ultra processed food addiction, again, doesn't really roll off the tongue. We need something that is going to be able to be, because I would say people with binge eating disorder probably have an addictive like pathology. They've just managed to fit the criteria of binge eating disorder. But really, for all of them, it's a loss of control. And I don't view them that profoundly differently, because it is the loss of control that is key to the fact that that person is really struggling with that. And I guess the eating disorders field really focuses on, and I think this is not necessarily capturing everyone as well, the idea of restriction and dieting, which we all know obviously is not great. But I think there's an over focus on that as being the be all and end all. So it's like this idea that if you just accept being in a larger body, then your eating disorder will go away. Yet if there's something about ultra processed foods and your brain, I think that's not captured by that sort of school of thought at all. And so that's why I do like the embracing of that addiction, but that addiction sort of thinking around the eating, because for many it is just a compulsive loss of control that means you can't change your behavior even though you want to. And it doesn't need to be volume. It can be, you could have had bariatric surgery and done all the things, yet, and you know, so maybe you can only have 800 calories that day, but you choose to have them in the form of, you know, chocolate and all the things that speak to your brain in that way, because you still have that addiction like pathology in your brain that makes it really, really hard not to say no to those foods. And you probably want to, because you've had major surgery to help achieve your health goals, and you want to eat healthy foods. You want to eat healthy foods, but you're still drawn to those foods. So I feel that we need to really start thinking about, instead of the eating disorders field being more about the eating behavior and the worrying about food restriction and diet culture perpetuating the eating disorders, which obviously that's an issue. But what about the foods?
Definitely. I resonate with so much of what you've said. I can tell that you are deeply passionate about this, and I appreciate the nuance that you're bringing. Seriously.
Ultimately, that loss of control is just like, I don't have agency, you know, like it's an experience that's like, I want to do something and I just can't. And a lot of the times it's just very unconscious as well. Not always, but often, right? And that brings us back to that biological piece that you were talking to earlier. So that's the crux of it, isn't it? What's really happening here biologically?
I feel like the crux of it, because you can have all the intent in the world, but you know, you turn up to that social event and there's that table full of the, you know, hors d'oeuvres, and before you know it, you're standing at the table with a mechanical arm, just eating all the hors d'oeuvres, and you're like, I just ate dinner. Why am I doing this? You know, so that prefrontal cortex that's thinking about, well, the consequences of this are you're going to feel really, really full and awful at the end, and go, why did I do that? Blah blah blah. It's almost that's shut off, and this, you know, the sort of limbic drive is just, it's almost habitual, robotic, and that has shut off, and you're just a primitive, you know, seeking out being.
I saw on your website that you are, I'm not sure if the study was completed or where it's at, so you can fill us in on this, but there was like, you're using like N-acetylcysteine for loss of control. Can you tell us about that? Is that like a supplement that people take to help them regain
I would
control,
love
or
to
what's
talk
that
about
about?
this. I would love to tell you about this. I'm glad you brought it up. So the lab that I was working in that had done all the work in the addiction field had found that N-acetylcysteine, which is literally a supplement that you can buy in health food stores, it's a powerful antioxidant. It also happens to act at different aspects of that synapse that I was telling you about. So you have all these transporters and exchanges that regulate that major neurotransmitter, which is called glutamate, in the synapse to keep that synapse healthy. And that is all changed in addiction. And when you get an N-acetylcysteine, it can restore the function of those synapses. It is a drug in the sense that it has an action and it's having this action in the brain, but it's generally regarded as safe, so it's not actually considered something that you need to get a prescription for. So that's why we really like the idea of it, because obviously people can go and get these GLP-1 medications, but and we're doing a trial at the moment looking at and we all know there's probably people out there that suffer from addictive eating and binge eating that are already on these medications for either diabetes or high weight. And we know that when we look at reviews and Reddit and things like that, and even just anecdotal evidence from people that I speak to, that people are really finding they're quite effective for reducing their cravings. Mm-hmm. So they have some potential, and that's what we've got a study going at the moment looking at what, because we talk about the reduction of food noise and similar and craving, so much so that this class of drugs are also being investigated and trialled for substance use disorder. So we're trying to work out what's going on in the brain there. Mm-hmm. So we're doing that, but they're very expensive. They're very expensive medications. They're not accessible. They're also, you have to inject yourself with a pen each week, so they're not particularly convenient. And a lot of people have adverse, effects. They might feel sick, nauseous, and that kind of thing. So it's good to have alternatives. And this N-acetylcysteine compound, we did a small feasibility trial in people that identified as having loss of control eating. We didn't recruit a clinical sample. We recruited from the community and asked people just to complete a questionnaire, which sort of is a questionnaire assessing whether they have a loss of control, because again, we thought that's the actual important thing that we focused on. And our preliminary, so the pilot was just for feasibility, but we did look at, it was single armed, so there was no placebo, but we did see good effect on loss of control. We would need to do more testing, but definitely considering it's readily available as a supplement. People take it as an antioxidant because antioxidants are good for you. It's a very powerful antioxidant. Mm-hmm. So people might take it. It might be something that people would take if they work out at the gym a lot, or they just want to take something that is good for their brain because it's an antioxidant. So it's not like it's a bad thing to take anyway. Yeah. So it is something that people could add into their daily plan to assist with and see if that helps. It's not profoundly bioavailable. So when you take, say, a gram or 2 grams of that, not a huge amount of that will get into the brain. So we're working on how we can improve that, but at the same time, it's completely safe to take. So, and antioxidants are really good for you anyway from a health perspective. Until we do the RCT, I can't sit there and say it's got efficacy for loss of control eating, but I can say that the results are promising, and so it's something that is there as an option for people if they want it. And it's very cheap. It's very cheap, and it comes in tablets, unlike the other more expensive medication options.
Great.
The irony of I've just been really sort of getting across the whole RCT thing, and I realise now it was very naive of me to not realise this earlier, that drug companies, randomised clinical trials are what you need to do to get drugs, through the whole approval for a particular indication. They're really expensive, and so obviously drug companies don't fund them unless can make money off whatever it is. And so our only option now, because it's not something people can make money off, drug companies can't make money off this, is to try and get government funding to do the RCT. That's our only option. But I can tell you right now that you could have it, just consume it through this knowledge. We can put it out there, and if we can ever get funding to do the RCT, we could hopefully get it prescribed for, you could have GPs saying it's indicated for loss of control eating, but then again, you also need that diagnosis. So
Right.
people that,
right.
so we've got a couple of issues here, right? We've got the issue with that if you suffer from uncontrolled eating behavior, because that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
For some of them, it happens to fit into a proper eating disorder diagnosis, but for many, it doesn't. You go to the your GP and say, look, I really struggle to control my eating. And then if you don't have a diagnosed eating disorder, you know, what do they say? Okay, I'm going to prescribe you this for what is it that you have? We don't have a diagnosis. That always troubles me. And then the other issue is that we still, to do RCTs on some of these, if you want to do an RCT for uncontrolled eating, no one's going to fund one. No one's going to fund a trial for what we don't have a diagnosis for. So if we're going to do an RCT for anything, it has to be for binge eating disorder or obesity. But really, it doesn't. Someone could be overweight or just mildly obese, and it could be metabolically relatively healthy. And so really, for them, it's about the eating behavior that they want to get on top of. So, and the weight is secondary to that. And if you're slightly overweight, or you know, you can be clinically obese and have very healthy metabolic profile. So there's also that argument that really it's only people that have metabolic disease that should be really on top of trying to get on top of that obesity. And actually, as we age, it's good to have a bit of, you know, evidence says now that it's actually better to have a few extra pounds.
I just have one more question from my side, which is, you know, your work spans across, you know, there's obesity, eating disorders, substance use disorder. Do you see, in your experience doing studies and sort of collaborating with all these fields, how do you see them either disjointed or connected? What's your take on how those fields work together?
You know, as a scientist, you can sort of, if you want, there's a lot of scientists that stay just safely in their little preclinical bubble, just working out how the brain works and thinking, well, if I find something that's relevant to people, fantastic. And then someone else can go and deal with actually making that happen, you know, in terms of getting that information out. But for me, and good on them, because sometimes they're just really good at what they do and they just need to focus on that. But for me, I feel like I want what we discover to eventually get to the people that need that information. And so as scientists, part of what we do is go to conferences and meet other scientists. And so even just from a which conference do I attend perspective, that's been hard. So I used to go to drug addiction conferences. And then when I came back from the States and I was studying this addictive like eating, I started going to obesity conferences. But at obesity conferences, wow, it's all about how do we treat the metabolic endpoint of obesity? How do we treat metabolic disease? Not how did we get there to begin with, just how do we treat it? Which obviously is really important, but there was kind of that lack of, it wasn't really a focus for them. And then moving into the eating disorders field, like I sort of was saying before, you know, you can't even mention the word obesity at an eating disorders conference, because there's this idea that if you are trying to help that person get to a healthy weight or reduce weight if that person wants to for health reasons, it does, you know, they're basically saying, no, that's triggering restriction. Because, I mean, let's face it, to lose weight, you are having to restrict your intake. Restricting intake is triggering for disordered eating. Like, it is essentially an incompatible situation. The two, I find the biggest clash is between obesity prevention and eating disorder prevention strategies, because essentially one begets the other. You can't avoid that. But I really would hope that we would have more conversations, because instead of just accepting, because the thing is, in the eating disorder field, there's a lot of people with disordered eating that also, there's some which say, I can't engage in a weight loss therapy because that will trigger my eating disorders horribly, and they recognize that. But there's others which say, I want, you know, I've got these comorbidities and I want to lose weight for health reasons, or I want to lose weight because that's what I want to do. That matters to me. And it's not because society's telling me that I'm fat. It's because I want to for myself. And I feel like those people don't have as much of a voice in the eating disorders space, because there's really strong voices around, oh, we cannot mention the O word. We can't talk about BMI as an endpoint because it's too triggering. Potentially the only reason why you want to lose weight is because society is telling you you should, but actually you don't. You just need to be happy in your larger body, which I think for some people it makes sense, but it cannot speak for everyone. So we just definitely need to have much more cohesion between the two fields. I think it's counterproductive. So like what you're saying, Vanessa, I think it is a challenge. It's a challenge also for progress, because really what all of us want is for more understanding of how this behavior can be, I'm sure everyone listening to this is saying, well, I just want help. I just want the most help I can for what I'm struggling with, whatever the name of it is, whatever it's called, whatever the outcome, and however it comes for each person, it's going to be different. I just want help. And in order for us to give that help, we just need the fields to sort of get along a bit better.
Wow. Yeah, beautifully said.
Robyn, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today and bringing up these fascinating topics. It's been a pleasure. Thank you again.
No worries. Lovely to be here.
Thank you.